What would happen if you were given the final exam paper for a subject you were studying on the first day of term before you even started learning? What about if you got in a fight and you knew everything that your opponent was going to do before anybody threw a punch? Well, I've got bad news about both of those scenarios. The first one means you're cheating at the exam, and the second one just isn't going to happen. But the good news is that both of those scenarios can give us clues about the most efficient ways to learn. And so in this video, we're going to talk about the value of pre-testing and how it can give you a framework to learn a whole bunch of different skills. First of all though, here's a slightly different question. What if you weren't given that final exam on the first day of term, but an old test paper instead? Well, firstly, you'd probably do terribly at it. You might not even understand the questions. And under some circumstances, that might hurt your confidence. But it might also make you do better at the course overall by changing the way you think about the stuff you're about to learn. One reason for this is something called the Fluency Illusion, which basically says that the easier we find learning something, the better we think we're going to be at recalling the information in the long run. So when we're passively reviewing notes, the Fluency Illusion is at its strongest. We're reading something we're already familiar with, and so we feel like we understand it. We don't know which parts of it we don't remember, and so we don't focus on them. To tie this back to fighting for a second, I think something similar happens here. Most people wildly overestimate how good they'd be at punching someone in real life, because they've only ever seen anyone do it on TV. So one way to combat the Fluency Illusion is testing, or what researchers increasingly call retrieval practice. Because when you're trying to pull text, formulas, skills, or ideas out of your memory, it feels much harder and gives you a clearer idea of what you still don't know yet. But what if instead of testing yourself on stuff you already know, you start testing yourself before you learn anything at all? That seems like it should be useless. But actually, in a series of studies, psychologists have found that unsuccessful retrieval attempts on tests, basically wrong answers, can alter how we think about and store the information in the questions. Or in the words of the experts, unsuccessful retrieval attempts enhance subsequent learning. So testing yourself on the questions before you have any hope of knowing the answers engages your brain in a different way to simply learning the material with no framework for what you're going to eventually need to know. But what if you're not just taking tests? This is something that I first started to seriously consider when I saw Craig Jones, who's basically the world's second best grappler, talking about how he teaches beginners classes.
I think the best way to learn is through problem solving. And I think if you show the technique before they've discovered that problem, the learning is sort of held back. So I like the idea of using kids style games to show them a problem and then use the techniques to fix the problems they've just discovered. I think that's the best way to learn.
So that's something that resonated with me. In the past, when I've taught classes, I think I've been guilty of giving people too much information, insisting that they learn every technical detail of a movement before they even really understand what it's for. And so for a while now, I've been starting every beginner's class with a challenge designed to let the beginners play around in a position without actually giving them any specific advice on what to do. And so the idea is that by the time you actually start working on the techniques, you've already got a feel for the challenges of the position. And this is also what the research suggests. For instance, the researcher called Elizabeth Bjork theorized that pre-testing primes students to notice concepts that will later become important, giving them a sense of what kinds of problems they're going to have to solve later. She actually did a small pilot study on this and found that students who were pre-tested on questions relating to materials that they then went on to study did 10% better in a later exam, saying,
"This invokes a kind of deeper processing of both the question and the alternatives. So later, now when you're encountering that information in the passage, it attracts your attention and you encode information not only about the correct answer, but also about those incorrect alternatives that you thought about."
So pre-testing gives you a framework for learning new things. But how do you make this work for you? Well, firstly, I think that when you're doing a subject where you can try a multiple choice test before you even start learning is definitely worth doing. It gives you a sense for what you'll need to know later, and it might even make you more receptive to the information. I don't think it works in every sphere. For instance, if you're trying to learn the Japanese kanji, it's going to be so initially confusing to you that doing a multiple choice test isn't actually going to help that much. But for physical skills, I think there's a clue in the fact that it works so well in multiple choice quizzes, where you can get the answer wrong, but it's at least clear what answers you're choosing between. So when I'm teaching, I make the games very simple and the rules very clear. So maybe you're trying to tag each other on the knee in wrestling practice, or try to gently tap the other person on the shoulder in boxing. This minimizes the amount of variables, or chaos if you like, make in the practice, and it helps you build an understanding of what you actually need to know. And I think it can also work for people who are well beyond the beginner stage, but here it kind of needs to be split into parts by a teacher who knows what they're doing. So for instance, maybe you're pretty decent at judo, but you want to get good at foot sweeps. Maybe at this point you limit yourself to only trying to use foot sweeps in a couple of rounds before you really learn the setups for them. After a while of seeing it not work and figuring out what the challenges in the position are, you're more primed to go back and watch an instructional or ask your own instructor what you should be doing, and you'll be more receptive to the information. Obviously, this isn't going to work with everything. I wouldn't do it with a sport where it's dangerous to make a single mistake, and I wouldn't do it with something like piano where you don't get clear, immediate feedback on your mistakes, and so you can build bad habits without ever realizing that you're learning them. But in areas where you can get clear, immediate feedback on your mistakes and use that to learn, I think pre-testing is a super valuable tool. And if you want to learn more about how testing in general is useful, then you should watch this video next. Thanks for watching.